Yep.
All right, let's see what we got going today. Does balanced matter? Well, I'm assuming we're not talking about our tires. And we're talking about balanced audio connections. And yeah, I mean, it's a good topic, I guess, because there's a lot of confusion about balanced. We see it on the threads a lot on the forums and stuff, and it is confusing if you don't understand amplifier topologies, and you got balanced inputs, and now headphones use balanced connections on the output of the amp, so they're not really all the same. So we got to talk about that for sure.
Yeah, this is actually a pretty common question that we get. People ask, how much does balance matter? And we make headphones, so that's actually a more challenging question to answer than you might imagine, like these things tend to be. So to the headphone, balance doesn't matter at all. It doesn't make one bit of difference whether you plug it in single-ended or balanced. Electrically, it's identical, no change whatsoever. There's no advantage. It's only from the transmission and the amplification that you could have an impact. So from like a balanced output perspective into the headphone, whether or not you have a balanced cable, a balanced connector, honestly, it makes absolutely no difference. The only change is if you plug a headphone in with a balanced cable to a balanced amplifier, it probably will have an impact. It probably makes a difference, but it doesn't matter to the headphone. It's about the actual amplifier itself.
Yeah, I think that's where some of the confusion lies, is that the headphone itself is basically each speaker has two leads. Right. I mean, technically, it's kind of balanced in itself. It's just two wires, plus and minus, and there's no real ground or anything, right? So technically, it's somewhat of a balanced device, so to speak. It doesn't have necessarily a ground reference. It takes on the reference of whatever you're plugging it into. So yeah, in the case of an amplifier, where the confusion lends itself with headphone amplifiers is that a lot of them, when you go plug into the balanced output of an amp, they're louder or they have more gain than the single-ended out, like the quarter-inch jack or stuff. And that's really the build of the amp. In that sense, then obviously the amplifier probably does have an internal topology that's at least somewhat balanced on its output stage, right? Whereas, and that's confusing too, but basically what we're saying is they're both of these leads, two here and two here, are being driven with signal. One's not necessarily ground. They both have signal. One's 180 degrees out of phase from the other, which basically doubles or increases the power to each side. So they're amplifying both leads, where on a single-ended amp design, one lead's ground, the other lead is got audio. So you tend to have, there's more electronics involved. There's more, obviously, both outputs. There's more output devices involved with a balanced topology amp, which is usually why they all tend to be higher. All higher power amps tend to have a balanced output topology. Now, that doesn't mean the amp is balanced internally. It could have a single-ended design throughout, and just its output stages, right, have multiple output stages to create a balanced topology. So there's confusion there. Now we need to talk about what's inside the amp. Some amps are full balanced through. Usually you're going to pay the big bucks for that. Usually you see it in the price, particularly in the two-channel world, because it's twice the electronics, right? You're actually amplifying, you're running two amplifier sections per channel. So there's actually it's like having, instead of two amps, one left, one right, there's four chains of amplification in a fully balanced amp. So they tend to be a bit more complicated and a bit more expensive. But and then we got to discuss inputs, right, Jason? Like we talk about, a lot of these amps have RC and XLR inputs, and that's confusing too.
Well, yeah. I mean, the biggest thing I think is the output voltage from like a source running at balance. Usually it's double the voltage, which some amps really need that to sound their best, to be
some
higher.
Headphones too.
Yeah, higher. Yeah, it depends how much power it puts out. Yeah. It definitely helps to have higher input voltage.
And that's the confusion. Like some amps are single-ended out, so they give you a 4-pin connector, right? But it's not really balanced. Two of the wires are just ground, and two are audio. And those amps, usually you can tell they're single-ended topology out and not balanced, because if you go to, say, the quarter-inch jack, which is an unbalanced, it's only got 3 conductors. It shares a ground on the left and right, right? So one on a quarter-inch or 6.3 millimeter jack, you got ground and then left channel audio, and right channel audio. So there's just 3 conductive paths. Where the 4-pin obviously has left plus minus and right plus minus, and the amplifier design choose whatever they want to do with those pins, right? So on a single-ended output designed amp, which is usually a lower power, portables are usually like that. The balanced in the 1/4-inch connector, the 4-pin and a 1/4-inch, or the 4-pin and the 3.5 millimeter. If they have the same volume on either one, then it's typically not a balanced topology output, and therefore it won't make a difference which one you use. But if the manufacturer tells you, well, you're going to get more power out of the 2.5 millimeter balance connector, right, or the 4-pin, then they're running more gain stages or more output stages on that connector than they are on the 1/4-inch. They're only running one side of the balanced on the 1/4, and the balanced has both sides balanced, so which usually gives you more power. So there's the confusion where people think balanced is better than, because typically when you plug into balanced with a headphone, you're usually getting more power.
Challenge, because it depends entirely on how the manufacturers design the balance connectors and the single-ended connectors. It's possible there's absolutely no difference between the two. Depends on the amp. Other times the balance could have a huge difference. Depends on the design philosophy, how it's designed internally, really. And so it's usually best to go with manufacturer's recommendation. But most of the time, if there's a balance connector on something, it's not just for convenience. It's there because it's designed to be used, and it is effectively designed to be a balanced amplifier or a DAC. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be better on that, and that's kind of a big challenge.
We've seen a lot of specs on this stuff too. Like I suppose if you don't own the amp yet, right, Jason? You could look at the specs. Right? It'll probably tell you like how much power out.
Well, you could, if you don't have it, you can go by the specs and see if it's a significant power difference between the single-ended and balanced output.
Yeah, because they usually tell you that.
Yeah.
In the specs, if it says 4 watts balanced and two on the 1/4-inch out, then okay, you're going to go balanced. Most of the time on a lower efficiency headphone like ours, you're going to want to go with the highest power rating. Other headphones you might not, but and then there's balanced inputs, which you didn't really cover. Balanced inputs to a device doesn't necessarily mean the amplifier is balanced. It just means that they gave you an input that happens to be an XLR jack. That can be converted inside to single-ended, or it may stay balanced through it. Again, depends on the internal topology of the amp. So there's confusion with that too, because just because you have a balanced input on a preamp or an amp doesn't mean it's balanced internally. A lot of them are converting the balance to single-ended, all right? Then they're running the amp or the preamp or whatever is running single-ended through, and then maybe they give you balanced outs again at the output, but it doesn't mean the amp itself or the preamp itself is fully balanced. So, and again, usually cost is a factor with that one. The more expensive a piece, usually that it's usually balanced through. So, and then like Eric, like the balanced inputs may or may not give you a benefit in terms of sound, right? So that's another choice, another discussion.
Yeah, so many times people think that buying a balanced cable will make their headphones sound better. They a lot of times think it's the cable that's making the difference, but it's really just in that particular circumstance, plugging into the balanced connector that you already have available on an amp probably is the better option. Generally, it's the way to go, but it doesn't always make a difference. In some cases, the balance connector is simply just another connector option, and it's single-ended internally. And so if that's the situation, plugging into a balanced or getting a balanced cable won't make any difference at all. It won't sound any better. It doesn't drive the headphone any differently. And most of the time, it's really just down to design philosophy for the amplifier. There are some benefits in some cases for noise rejection on the transmission through a cable. So maybe between the DAC to the amp. But a lot of times these setups are pretty minor for headphones. It's not a super duper complex setup.
People aren't running like 100 miles of cable and stuff like that. You're lucky if you have 3 feet. So, but yeah, balance connections can help on the inputs. I mean, if you're running like from a source to an amp, and what in the 2-channel world, my recommendation was always to go go with the manufacturer. If the manufacturer has paid particular attention to their balanced ins and outs, then you probably want to connect it that way. If they don't say anything or mention anything, you don't hear anything about it, or no one tells you, then it probably doesn't matter. RCA is typically the default connector for most people in stereo. XLRs tends to be in terms of signals. I'm talking going from the source to the amp. XLR connections tend to be more geared toward the higher end gear. You find guys that have more pricey gear tend to run balanced connections more so because the gear is balanced. But yeah, if the gear isn't really balanced through where it has multiple channels of amplification, full balanced. Running it balanced in and out probably isn't better. I'm sorry, running balanced ins from it, we're talking about the gear now, not the headphones. Running balanced cables is probably not going to be better. In fact, it could be worse. There is some reduction of noise, like a 6 dB down noise floor, but that depends. That's a variable. And if you're going into an amp that's single-ended and it's with balance connections, now it's got to dumb down that balance to single-ended. So it's converting it to single-ended. So you're not really doing yourself a favor if you're going to add even one stage of electronics, to go in balance versus going in RCA, not needing that to dumb down to single-ended. It depends on the topology of the amp, though. It's a lot of confusion. So the norm would be to run single-ended RCA interconnects for most applications, unless the manufacturer of the gear says, or you paid the big bucks for a full balance differential amp setup, then you're going to want to run balanced, right? And then on the output of the headphone, depends on the headphone, but on our bigger headphones or our headphones, if you're running a desktop, our default connector is a 4-pin XLR anyway. We're almost always people are going to go with the 4-pin, so you have a balanced connection always available, right? So it doesn't matter what amp you get. You're just plugging balanced all the time, and you're good. Nothing to think about.
Yeah. Well, either way, if it makes a difference or not, we know that most 1266 owners that get HP cables run 4-pin XLRs.
Yeah, almost universal. And almost all amps they run are going to have that connector. And if it doesn't, it's probably not a big amp. It's probably not a big enough amp for the 1266, with exceptions. Some of the big tube amps that are out there, they're old school designers and they just keep putting 1/4-inch connectors on them, But I think most of them now have added the 4-pin because it's so universal. We still see 1/4-inch. Hell, the Dave has a 1/4-inch out. Why? I don't know.
Yeah, that's probably the majority of the 1/4-inch 1266 owners.
Yeah, right. So
it's nice that things are moving closer to a standard, because for the longest time there was no uniformity. There was dual 3-pin XLRs for quite a while on a few of the high-end amps.
Right.
But now we're seeing very commonly, if it's higher end, 4-pin XLR all day. And if it's lower end, it's probably single-ended. But that seems to be a way manufacturers are kind of separating their higher end stuff from the lower end stuff. They just put balance on the higher end stuff and they exclude it a lot of times from the lower end. It's not really like a feature per se. It's not necessarily intrinsically better, but a lot of times if it has balanced on it, it is better.
Yeah,
Doesn't mean the balance makes it better, but
all those jacks are just connected together on the front panel of the equipment. So, they can give you all the jacks, but if it's a single-ended toy amp, then they're all going to sound the same. So most like you said, at that usually you're at a lower price point where those things cost more jacks, more money, more assembly, more soldering. So most of the lower cost stuff avoids all that crap and just will give you 1 or 2 options at best.
Modern gear in headphones, at least, you could almost guarantee that if it has a balance, it's probably best to use the balanced over the single-ended, but that isn't always the case. So manufacturers' recommendations are probably still the way to go.
Yeah. So that's what I see most of the time. You're going to run RCA interconnect unless the gear is specifically designed to be balanced, and you're going to run 4-pin, and you're good to go. And the cool thing about 4-pin with a balance connector on a headphone is that you can adapt that down to a single-ended, right? Like the 1266, the light version comes with a 4-pin cable, and it comes with a flexible adapter that has a 4-pin female to a 1/4-inch. So that automatically you've got both the major connectors with the headphone, and almost every amp that headphone goes with, that's pretty much what you're going to use, those 2 connectors. So anyway, we got this figured out. It just comes with what you need. The one thing we didn't talk about is the actual cable on the headphone. If somebody does go out and says, okay, I'm going to buy a balance, they didn't have a balance cable, they didn't have a cable with a 4-pin. I'm going to go out and buy a balance cable. If it's a different design cable from a different manufacturer, it itself might change the sound. It might not be the fact that you're plugging into a balance connection on the amp. It might be that, part of it might be due to you got a better cable in the balance than you did in what came with the headphone or something like that. So you got to watch that too, because that's a little bit of a point of confusion if you're running exactly the same cable from the same manufacturer and one's balanced and one's ain't. Okay, that's apples to oranges, but so it's apples to apples. Yeah, it's comparing apples to apples. But as soon as you throw a different cable in the mix, then part of that might be due to that. So you got to be careful of that one too. Anyway, probably a good time to wrap this one up. And, like I said, if there's any issues, just give us a call or give us an email. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. Remember, we're going to run something over when we hit 1,000 subscribers. We're getting close pretty quick with everyone being home and watching our videos. So take care, everyone. Be well.